oh man, happy 2023. I'll tell you, we were talking in the back, and you're going to hear a few bad jokes tonight about things being on fire and a hot topic, and so just groan and go with it. Joe's actually drinking every time we make a bad joke, so it's just part of the program. Yeah, maybe you guys are too. Welcome to Sense of Place, Season 13. This is the world premiere, the universe premiere in 2023 of Sense of Place, and I'm really excited to have you. I'm fired up that you're here. Oh, you guys, thank you. You guys are too nice. My name is Sarah Fox. I'm the host and curator of Sense of Place, and this night has been a long time coming. For those of you who were at our season finale last season, we had a talk on the timber wars where we looked at our forests and our public land and how we're managing our trees. And for those of you who have followed the news in the Northwest for a while, it sort of all harkens back to the story of the environmentalists and the spotted owl versus the timber industry, which is the way the story gets boiled down, but we all know it's way more nuanced than that. So that was the season finale for last season, and it needed 4 people to help tackle that topic. And all 4 of them were excited to talk about wildfire as part of that, and I said, you can do a little bit, but not a lot, because it is a very big topic, and we are gonna do a full presentation on it soon. So this is me making that promise come true. I just want you guys to know that. I made the promise, and I stuck to it. So that's what we're having tonight. And we've got 3 people here tonight who are incredibly well-versed in this field from different perspectives, from both on the ground, from the research level, Jessica Hudek, Loretta Duke, and Brian Harvey, who you guys are going to meet in just a little bit. But first, let's see, I'm trying to think of the order of these 2 things. I think that what I want to do first is tell you the story of, well, the reason that they were making fun of me in the back room there was, I always try to, when I get to talk about the sponsors, do something a little more interesting, because every time I hear someone say, we'd like to thank our sponsors, I kind of start to doze off, and I'm like, yeah, they're just saying that because they have to say it. And I get really excited about our sponsors, as they know. And so I was trying to think tonight, like, what's the fire analogy that I can use that represents our sponsors? And I was like, our sponsors are like a mega fire. And I was like, ooh, I don't know if that's what you want to say. That doesn't sound good. Our sponsors are like the spark in a wildfire. And I was like, oh, I don't think they want to be that necessarily either. And they were making fun of me because the only thing I could think of is if anyone here saw the movie Backdraft with that one Baldwin brother who you know, but you never remember his name. And there's this scene, I actually think this scene exists in any fire movie, where it's like the firefighters have the full gear on and they've got axes over their shoulders, and there's a fire to go and fight, and everything slows down, and they're walking in, and you look at it, and you're like, yes, that fire is gonna get its butt kicked by these guys. And so that is what I imagine our sponsors are. So if you are a sponsor out there tonight, you just imagine, okay? I told you guys. I told you. So another person who, I won't make do the slow walk, but another person that's important for you guys to meet tonight is Tucker. Gosh dang, your name's gonna make me nervous for a long time. Simkowitz. Okay, I'm a Fox. No one's ever had a problem with my last name, okay? So as many of you know, Sense of Place is a program of Mount Adams Institute, which is an awesome local nonprofit. And they do work not only locally, but nationally, including the Vets Work Fire program. And we just got a new leader, Tucker. Tucker, if you stand up here. So I told Tucker to comb his hair and practice his smile. I didn't tell him, but you guys all know, because you've been here before, that for new EDs, we also request either an impromptu rap song or a dance. So I know.
Yeah.
Oh, No, but Tucker, I want you to see what he looks like. This is literally day
7.
Okay, day 7. So, welcome, Tucker. We are so lucky to have him. He joined us from the Telluride Institute. He has a background in environmental and experiential education. We are pumped to have him on board. He's been in the Gorge for a couple of years, so now he's getting made official here tonight. And at some point, when you've been around a little longer, we'll do the interpretive dance, the rap song. Okay.
And I did cut my hair for this event.
Noticed.
Yeah.
It looks good. Do you want to do a spin and kind of show like the full? I like that. That's Tucker, you guys. Thank you. Be careful when I ask you to sit front row, okay? That's when you know it's trouble. All right. I want to get on to tonight because it's a huge topic. I don't feel like it's a topic I need to go a lot into why it's important. Missed a chance. Okay. Then Brian Harvey's going to join us and sort of now look forward. He is doing research, which I'll tell you more about and you'll hear more about, looking at what are the effects of wildfire in a place like Eagle Creek and what does that tell you about this. So we'll hear more about them each as we go. But first, I want to officially introduce Jessica Hudek, who is a longtime and dear friend and a badass in so many ways. Jessica is officially a fire ecologist on the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. But she, like Loretta, has a background in wildland firefighting, so she has been on the ground. And she spent 11 years working in fire management, so thinking about how do we make decisions around wildfires. And even in her role now is still doing a lot of work as far as long-term analyzing the fires and the effects of them, and also being an incident commander at times as well. So this is Jessica Hudek. Please help me welcome her, and thank you all. It was a big night tonight. We had a lot going on, so we're just gonna do.
I'm sure you guys can't hear me without it.
Joe, keep me hit. There we go.
Test.
I know, Joe, I'm trying.
I'll try not to yell. That's my problem. I get excited. Let me start this up here. Okay. I actually can't see you because there's lights in my face, so that'll make it easy. Right up to it, really? Okay. I'll stand right here. I won't move. It's going to be hard for me. I like to walk and talk. And thank you, Sarah, for the intro. A lot of that I was going to say, so that makes it easy to get off the ground and just jump right in. I also want to say it's so lovely to see you all here tonight. What I can see of you, anyway.
Wait, you know. Okay, make noise real quick so she knows you're here.
Thank you. But just being here together, sharing this night, learning from each other, it's inspiring. I'm excited to be here. So I'm going to jump right in. As Sarah said, we got a lot to cover tonight. So my presentation is called Good Fire, Bad Fire, the Philosophy of Fire Management, and you'll see why. So let's start out tonight. I'm looking up there like there's my presentation, but it's not there. Is it supposed to be there? There we go. That's what you see. You didn't see my first slide. Here, let me show you. Ta-da! Okay, so fire. It's a hot topic. Here we go. There's your hot one. Volatile topic. It's also become an increasingly difficult topic because fire really provokes an emotional response in people, depending on what your experience with fire has been. A colleague of mine at the Nature Conservancy, I heard refer to fire as the ultimate contradiction. And I really like that, right? Because fire is beautiful, yet also terrifying. It follows some laws of physics, yet it also remains largely unpredictable. And it's destructive, yet also renewing and life-giving, all at the same time. It's also inevitable. It has been and will continue to be a part of our western forests. And so that's part of why we're here tonight, because it's really in our best interest to understand it. This is something that's not going anywhere. So for the sake of tonight, in building this foundation of common understanding that we can dive deeper into with our other speakers tonight, I want us to think about fire simply as an agent of change. It provides a variety of effects to our resources and serves a whole range of different functions. Fire ecology, then, is the interaction of fire, this agent of change, with living organisms and the environment. So when we think about fire ecology, we're thinking about questions like, how do high severity versus low severity fires differ in their effects to certain wildlife habitats? How does a big fire differ from a small fire in terms of regeneration, invasive weeds? And maybe how does fire management or other types of land management affect what happens after a fire, affects the long-term fire on a landscape? The next thing I want to talk about, and this is the only other definition I have, just a couple definition slides to get us off the ground here, is fire regime. Fire regimes are the patterns of wildland fires. We're talking about the frequency, how often a fire usually occurs on a landscape, the severity. And when we talk about severity, we're usually talking about how many trees have been killed or how much mineral soil has been exposed. The seasonality, what time of year do fires usually burn in this environment? And the extent, how big do fires usually get? And this, of course, is going to vary. It's going to vary by climate, landform, and the associated vegetation types. So I put a map up here of the soil burn severity from the Eagle Creek fire, and Brian's going to talk more about fire severity, and he's got the veg severity map. So I'm not going to spend any time on this other than to say, you can see there's a mosaic burn pattern. There's a variety of different severities on the landscape, and this fire burns in an east to west pattern, and about half the fire burned in a higher severity or moderate severity, about half of it burned in a low or unburned state. So again, this is the pattern. When you talk about fire regime, how a fire naturally wants to behave on a landscape because of where it is. So to recap those few terms we have fire. It's an agent of change. Fire ecology, how fire interacts with living organisms and the environment. And fire regime, the patterns of fire, how it naturally wants to behave on the landscape. Let's get into the more interesting stuff. Are they good or are they bad? What do you guys think? Good, bad, good, bad. Thumbs up for good. What do you guys think? Good? Thumbs down for bad. Wave your hands like sparkles for you don't know, or maybe both. Well, I'll start by saying that our historic media messaging would certainly have us believe that a lot of fires are maybe not very good. We have messages like, fire is our most shameful waste. This shameful waste weakens America. This one's my favorite. Remember, there are babes in the forest. And there are countless photos of Smokey Bear carrying some fawns out of the woods. I posed to Brian that perhaps a future fire ecology question that his lab could investigate is the effects of fire on the deer populations with and without Smokey Bear. The Smokey Bear Wildfire Prevention Campaign began in 1944 and is the longest running public service advertising campaign in US history. Our thinking and our messaging has evolved over the years, and particularly starting around the turn of the 21st century, we see a lot more messaging around this good fire versus bad fire, and this idea that maybe not all fires are bad. The Forest Service and the Nature Conservancy actually even teamed up in the early 2000s to come up with a report, Good Fire, Bad Fire, how to think about forest land management and ecological processes. So, we recognize fire as an agent of change, and that the changes that fire causes can be good or bad, maybe good and bad. But how do we assess that? And what do we do with that information? If you take only one thing from my 10 or 15 minutes of fame here tonight, I hope it is that fire, as that agent of change, is inherently neither good nor bad, right? The perception of good or bad depends on our human-imposed values for the things that fire affects. Fire affects all kinds of things. We have human life, or firefighter and public safety, as we like to say. Wildlife, water, aquatic resources, timber, cultural resources, infrastructure, property, recreation, spirituality. I could go on. Fire affects all of these things, and whether we collectively, as a society, see the changes that fire causes to these values as good or bad influences our management. Because placing value on the resource is really the whole premise for management. So we can have more of what we want and less of what we don't want. Interestingly, our values really haven't changed that much over time. I pulled some excerpts from the Summary of Fire Activity from 1910 to 1915 for the Columbia Gorge Ranger District of the Oregon National Forest. It's hard to say because it's different than what we call things today, right? But we see references to some stands of excellent quality, referring to timber, that the most dangerous burns lie directly off the Bull Run watershed, which most of us know as the city of Portland's water supply and a big concern whenever there's a fire anywhere in the remote proximity. We see that considered merely from an economic standpoint, the timber adjoining the railroad along the bluffs of the river is of but little commercial importance. Its value from an aesthetic standpoint, however, is almost incalculable. We see that $15,000 worth of green timber was lost, but what is far more important is that it was kept from the Bull Run watershed. And finally, we see a reference to the historic highway and the portion west of Eagle Creek that says it traverses an area and is so important in its recreational value. And considered from a recreational and public standpoint, this district is the most important in the forest. This is 1916, 70 years before the National Scenic Area was established, but they were thinking the same things, those aesthetic values, those scenic values, those recreational values that all came into play and continue to come into play with our management of fires in this area. So, how do we use those values to determine our management response in the event of a fire? Well, Loretta's going to talk about the specifics of Eagle Creek, but I'll just kind of whet your appetite with some really general examples. First, maybe we have a wilderness fire. No structures, no timber, no commercial harvestable timber, no roads, difficult access. In this case, we might make the choice or make the decision to let fire play its natural role while confining it to the wilderness. That's one possible choice we might make. In contrast, if we have fire in the wild and urban interface, like we have here, Dodson at the base of Yen Mountain on the left, and then of course Multnomah Falls on the right, here our management response might be to control a fire, to put it out as quickly as possible in the smallest footprint possible. It's important to point out, though, that fires, especially large fires, can have multiple response strategies. It's not a one-size-fits-all once you make a decision. It depends on your configuration of values across the landscape. So, again, Loretta will get into it more, but Eagle Creek Fire had many, many values of concern that merited different types of strategies and different types of responses in different areas. So that's our response. That's how we think about values during the actual fire management response. But then after a fire, we also have to think about what was lost, gained, or changed because the fire occurred. And do we want to do further management post-burn because of that? Example, recreation. Oftentimes we have an area that was super highly used before a fire. It's not used as much after a fire. Why is that? Has a particular value been removed or reduced? Well, this one's a pretty easy answer. Humans simply have a harder time appreciating the aesthetics of a burned forest than of a green forest. So should we do something about that? With Eagle Creek, there were lots of hydrologic related and infrastructure values to consider because of debris flow and those steep drainages with high severity fire effects. We had threats to clean water, to the infrastructure, and to threatened endangered species. Does this merit some management response? Finally, we have historic and cultural values. Here we have a picture of the Oneata Tunnel, the historic condition, the restored condition before the fire, a few years prior to the fire, and then what it looked like after the fire burned it again. I put this one up here because I thought it was a good backdrop for the discussion about the fact that it's really easy to focus on our values lost when we think about the changes caused by wildfire. Loss of cultural resources, loss of habitat for certain species, loss of recreation opportunities for gosh, how many years and going now, spiritual value that we lost associated with large, old trees. But we really need to consider those things in conjunction with our values gained, because every time we lose habitat for one species, we gain it for another species. We have opportunities to improve our sustainable recreation infrastructure. There's more scenic views. And honestly, there's some real spiritual value associated simply with witnessing that awe-inspiring power of fire. I think so anyway. If you saw Eagle Creek, you know what I'm talking about. Some value changes are easier to assess than others. It's pretty simple to assess how fire affected a property value or even timber values, but it's much more difficult to see how fire affects ecological values and ecological processes because they're so multifaceted and so dynamic. That's why we have researchers like Brian who are asking those hard questions. They're trying to figure out, how does the way a fire burned and maybe our management response influence what happens next here? We see things, what do I have up here? These are all things from our burned area emergency response report. We have revegetation we're looking at. We have a mold mat that protects the soil surface from raindrop detachment and transport if you want to research erosion. We have Canada thistle, an invasive weed sprouting after fire if you want to talk about native versus non-native. And then I think I have one more. There it is. We have this picture. This is Multnomah Creek, so this is upstream of Multnomah Falls. Here you can see the pattern left by the range of fire severities. We call this is the mosaic effect, right, of living in dead trees that we know from years and years of research allows for a faster rebound of the burned forest. There's less erosion in these areas. There's relatively high diversity in this small area. So this is my last slide. I'm going to wrap up here. This is Angel's Rest. It burned in 1991 and again in the Eagle Creek fire. I want to re-summarize here, though. We started out with fire. Fire is an agent of change. Inherently, it's neither good nor bad. It's when humans assign value to the things that fire affects that it provokes this emotional response and becomes either good or bad. Human values have a huge influence on our fire management decisions. As an ecologist, I have to say that unfortunately, managing fires based on human values alone doesn't always align well with the natural fire regime, those ways that fire wants to behave based on its climate, landforms, topography, vegetation. So ideally, we really need to consider both in fire management if we're to provide ecological integrity and protect our natural resources long term. So as you hear Loretta and Brian and Sarah in their discussions with them tonight, I urge you to think about what it is that you value, what we as a society value, because good or bad, fire is not going anywhere, and it's these values that really affect our philosophy of how we manage them. Thank you.
Jessica, thank you. Okay, Loretta. I'll tell you, if I've learned anything about Loretta, and Joe, can you switch over to my computer here? Oh, look at that. See, fire ecologists are real people too. They have families. Oh, gosh. Okay. Oh, yeah. You getting that turned on?
Let's see, can you hear me?
All right, so Joe, when you're ready, hopefully you have Loretta's Lav, my mic, my laptop. That's okay, you guys. I put a lot on Joe tonight with 3 people in different formats, but I said that all of you guys would be fine with it, so be fine with it, okay? So what I was going to say about Loretta is that, God, she is just running around, waving her hands, saying, look at me. It's all about you, Loretta. No, in all honesty, when Loretta's name came across my desk as someone who maybe should be included here tonight for many reasons, and I continued to sort of talk to the folks that I knew who knew fire and say, well, I think we're gonna have Loretta. And without any exception, everyone said, oh, Loretta's really good. Oh, Loretta. I mean, with that name, you have to be amazing, So this is Loretta Duke. She's the fire management officer for the south zone of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest now. And we're going to talk some about how you got into wildfire. I'm going to have you share that. Okay. But the thing that I'm hoping you all get to hear the most about tonight was in your role as the you guys and your acronyms.
Initial attack incident commander.
Okay, so Joe, if you can crank her gain up a little bit, that would be good. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. Loretta and I are just gonna have a conversation, and I would love for you to first tell folks how you ended up in fire in the first place, because it wasn't what you set out to do.
No, like many firefighters, that's not what we set out to do. And we start on another path, and I thought that I was going to be a silviculturist, somebody who basically is the doctor of the forest, is what we would call a silviculturist. And so I was going to school in forestry, and I went to school at Utah State University, and I was trying to get residency because I was an out-of-state student, and it was really expensive. So I saw this job that was available, and it was right there in my college town in Logan, Utah. And I applied for it, and little did I know that after I got the job and started, they said, okay, we are going to be hotshots this year. And I was like, what? I'm going from 0 to hotshot? So,
tell people who might not know what a hotshot is.
A hotshot is a highly trained group of 20 people who go to the hottest part of the fires and do the most work. And back in those days, there was no work-rest guidelines. So you might actually work for 40 hours, and then you might get 8 hours off, and then you might work 20 hours and get 4 hours off. And yeah, it's a little insane. Now we actually realize that people need sleep in order to make good decisions.
Hot shots. I grew up in Oregon, and even as a kid, I knew what hot shots were. It was a very, very well-respected thing. So I want to have you take us back to September 2nd and sort of set the scene for us that day and take me forward into getting the call or the text or whatever came your way.
So like many people, that was the day of Labor Day weekend. It was also one of the hottest days of the year. I think the temperature was about 104, and I was, like many people, with friends swimming in a local creek. And after we were done, I decided to stop and get a burger on my way home. And as I'm finishing my burger, I get a phone call from my boss. It was my first day off in 14 days. I had been covering the home unit while my boss and my coworker were out on fire assignment. So I get this call, and I'm thinking, oh yeah, there's definitely a fire going on. He wouldn't be calling me on my first day off of what is supposed to be 2 days off. But he says, I answered the phone. I said, hey, what's up? And he said, oh, we got a fire, and they're already calling for a Type 3 IC. It's in Eagle Creek. And I said, okay, I'll go home and change clothes, and I'll be right there.
Real quick, tell us Type 3 IC.
Type 3 Incident Commander. So in fire management, there are 5 levels of Incident Commander. A Type 5 IC pretty much supervises maybe a small handful of people, a little lightning strike fire or a little escape campfire where they can put it out with just their module. That's a Type 5. A Type 4, you might have 2, 3, 4, maybe a few more modules. Maybe you'll have a helicopter and you have to use it to help kind of mitigate the fire behavior before you go in and dig some line and put it out. And then a Type 3 is more complex, where you might actually have not only one helicopter, you might have multiple helicopters, you might have multiple resources, crews, engines, water tenders, dozers. You might have lots of things that you're dealing with. And then a type 2 incident management team comes with about 40 to 50 people, and they help manage the incident. And then there could be up to 500 people. And then a type 1 team has the most complex of all jobs, and they usually come with 60 people to manage the situation.
So you get the call and you hear that it's basically leapfrog straight to
Type 3.
type 3 and take what's going through your head.
Well, he says it's in Eagle Creek, and I know Eagle Creek is very steep. So yeah, I went home and I got ready as fast as I could, and I didn't even stop and talk to my boss in the office. I got in my truck and went down there and called him on my way there. And you know, when you go to a fire call, there's a lot of anticipation. What am I going to see? Okay, what do I need to be thinking about? Okay, who's on scene? So I ask him who's there and what are they doing, and kind of get some essay. And fortunately, I already had somebody there who was an IC Type 3 trainee, and I had worked with him for a number of years, not only here in the Gorge, but where I'd worked previously. He had also worked there. So we had a long history together, and he's also very qualified, and so I felt very good that I was being partnered up with the best person that we could have possibly had at that time. So
I feel like I should say here that one of the things Loretta told me early on was in one of her many efforts to defer and deflect attention, she said, if in this sort of fire management situation, if you are making decisions in a vacuum, you're not doing it right. And what she said time and again, and I think we'll see, is that you had a lot of people there with you weighing in. And
yes.
so you arrive on the scene, and then what do you do? I mean, I can't even imagine how you assess something like that.
Yeah, so basically we were really focused on, okay, how many people are up here? I was actually swimming that day. I know there were a ton of people swimming up there. So we're trying to figure out, and we've got the county sheriffs on board. They're there. They're trying, well, they arrived a little after we did, but they know that there are people out there because there are people calling on their cell phones saying, there's a fire below us and we can't get out. And so first we hear that there's 15 people, then we hear there's 25 people, then we hear there's 50 people. And then when somebody finally was able to get into there were 150 people there.
I'm guessing that's not very common.
That is really not like anything that I had experienced in my career, which spans more than 30 years.
So you walk into a scene at one of the most popular hiking places, 150 people, the hottest or one of the hottest days of the year in a really dry time in steep territory.
Yeah.
What's your first step?
Our first step was to deal with scene safety, and that is how are we going to get communication with the hikers, figure out what's the safest route. We've got the sheriff's office, and they're responsible for all medical and search and rescue emergencies. So it's really on them, but we need to be in partnership with them to help them figure out what is the risk and what are we going to do and how are we going to get them out.
So take us through. So here you guys see a photo of some of the many hikers. A lot of them who you said maybe had a bag, a lot of them who maybe just had, and we don't have a photo, the one you shared where it's just like towels around their neck, basically.
Yeah. So the hikers ranged in age from 3 to 73 years old. And there was one type 1 diabetic in the crowd, and most of them had very little in terms of the 10 essentials. How many of you know the 10 essentials? Okay.
You're not leaving until you pass Loretta's test.
Yes, so some of them even had sandals because it's a 2-mile hike up there. you know, they're wearing Chacos. Those are hiking shoes, right? So, yeah.
So the problem was, I just have this photo here so you guys can see, like, here's trail and here's fire. So it's not like you could just say, okay, everyone, go back out the way you came. They're literally stranded up there. So one of the photos that Loretta shared with me, you can see this here. It says, ignore first message, stay put, we see you, danger. So tell me what's going on here.
So that was one of the helicopter managers, and he was trying to get messages to the hikers. At first, he was telling them to go uphill, but the Indian Creek fire was also going on at the same time, and it was on the Mount Hood National Forest above where the Eagle Creek fire was. And because it was a hot, dry day, it was a pretty active fire as well as the Eagle Creek fire. So first he says, get away from the Indian Creek fire, and then he says, no, go toward it, and then he's like, no, okay, we're going to figure out what needs to happen here. And so he's dropping these messages down and, trying to figure out what can we do here.
And so what finally happened? And the reason I'm focusing on this people piece is because it's really unique, and I think, like Jessica talked about, the human piece was the value at the start.
Yes.
Yeah. So tell me what's going on here.
Okay, so they had to stay all night just adjacent to the Indian Creek fire. And we kept trying to call somebody from the Indian Creek fire because we knew that there were security folks who were keeping hikers from going any higher than High Bridge into the Indian Creek fire. And the first one we called said he went down to High Bridge, he opened the gate, and he saw 10, 15 people. That's where the first report came from. And then we said, you know, we think there are more. There are a lot of 911 calls. Can you hike further down? And he said, I'm not comfortable with that. I don't really have enough fire experience. And then Sharon Staridi, who had been a long-time wilderness ranger and had been on many fires, she got on the radio and said, I'll go down there and help them out. And so she loaded her backpack up with a bunch of water and some food and went down and gathered them all up and took them up there and then communicated with them all night. And the Air National Guard was also helping at the same time, trying to get resources to these hikers, you know, more food, more water. And there was also 3 hikers that were stuck on Ruckle Ridge that had to be hoisted out of there. And that got overshadowed by 150 people. So I don't know if people had heard that story, but yeah, 3 hikers actually got trapped by fire on all sides of them on Ruckle Ridge, and the hoist ship actually came down and brought them out of there. So, and then after that, it was, okay, let's get resources to these hikers, but it started getting dark and their instrumentation went down that they actually used to fly at night, so they had to abandon that. So it was all up to Sharon at that point, and then the Crag Rats went up from Wadham Lake and hiked down the next day, along with half of a fire crew.
One of the things that you and I talked about when we were talking is I was like, you know, I think I had this naive belief that, oh, the fire hits and then you go through these steps and here's what you do. And maybe that can happen in a building because the buildings are square and we know what they are and they're man-made. But that the reality of a situation like this is you can have protocol, but it's going to be different every single time.
That's what makes our job interesting.
Good. So tell me what's going on here with this gate over a bridge.
Yeah, so that gate was in front of the bridge. I believe that's High Bridge. And that was gated off so that the hikers wouldn't go into the Indian Creek fire. And so they unlocked the chains on the gate and then just put it on top because there was no other place to put it without just throwing it down in the woods, and then that's littering. We don't like that.
Even under duress, you guys, so you can pick up your trash too, okay? Do you mind sharing about just the challenge of management and the decision around when Indian Creek was hopping the decision to keep Eagle Creek open? Because I think
Yeah.
sometimes that sort of thing, there's a
Right.
lot at play.
Right. Sarah said, that's a big decision. I was like, oh no. Yeah, you're right. That's a big decision. Somebody a lot more, like many GS levels higher than me had to make that decision. But it was not made without some really good science. And fire modeling was done, and it never showed the fire actually coming out to Eagle Creek. It is one of the most popular trails in the gorge, and maybe even Oregon. I'm not sure. But anyway, so the scenic area manager or the forest supervisor had to make that decision, but seeing the fire modeling, she knew that the chances of it actually getting to Eagle Creek down, because fires usually run uphill and they run in east winds to the west. And yeah, the Indian Creek fire moved during this event, but the way it moved was, very small in comparison with when the east winds event came a few days later, and then it traveled mostly to the west.
Speaking of east winds, so Loretta sent me this, and she's like, this is really important. And I was like, I get this all the time from you scientist types. You show me a graph and you tell me it's important, and I say, I don't think so. So I love all you scientist types, but you convinced me on this one. So tell me what you expected, speaking of the fire moving, and what this graph shows the reality of what happened.
So we had a spot weather forecast, and the National Weather Service actually does a weather forecast specific to the area of the fire. And our spot weather forecast for Monday, September 4th, said that we would have east winds, and they would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 to 10 miles an hour, with gusts up to 20 miles an hour. And what we had were sustained winds of around 20 to 25 miles an hour, with gusts up to 40 miles an hour.
That's that big blue arch in the middle.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was supposed to be much lower. Yeah. Okay. So I just want to show you guys some of the things that she shared, so you get a sense of the things that you were looking at. So you were the one on the ground calling the shots with people with you, and then at some point the next team is ready to go. They needed the time to get ready, they're ready, and they step in. And tell me what happens.
Yeah, so they stepped in on Monday, September 4th, and that's when we know the east wind is coming. We didn't know how big it was going to be. And they actually asked us, they asked myself, they asked the FMO, they asked my trainee, what do you think the potential of this fire is? And I said, well, this thing moved 3.5 miles in a very light west wind. So in the east wind, if it's going to be almost 3 times as much as the wind speed is going to be 3 times as much, I'm going to say the fire will move 3 times as far. So we looked at a map and they said, wow, that's down by Bridal Veil. And then I started second guessing myself. Is it really going to move like to Bridal Veil? Well, I was like, yeah, I can move that far. I mean, I don't know if it's going to move that far. And then they said, do you think it can spot across the river? And I was like, well, it's never spotted across the river in this portion of the gorge. It has in the Dalles before. But I don't think so. Obviously, we're just making guesses at this point. But as you know, it moved down to Bridalville and beyond and kind of started going up toward Larch Mountain. And it spotted across the river to Archer Mountain.
This photo here, Loretta pointed out to me that water you see coming off the top of the hose, that's a person there.
Yes. That is at Multnomah Falls, and they are actually spraying over the shake roof so that it won't burn.
Can you just tell people, I mean, we know what the helicopter's doing. Can you tell people what the red boxes are? That's the technical name, you guys.
Yeah. Those are folded tanks, and that's how we get water staged and then use pumps and hose lays to mop fires up, to put them out. And a lot of people think, oh yeah, you just squirt fire on it and it's out. No, you remove the fuel, and then you've got to actually extinguish the fire within a certain distance so it doesn't spot over. So there's a fire line that's built, and then there's mop up that occurs after that.
So when we see a big fire and we think, just send more planes up, send more helicopters.
Yeah, so.
Is that your favorite thing for us to say?
Yeah, that's one thing that I would like everybody to know, that helicopters don't put out fires. Retardant doesn't put out fires. They don't call it fire putter outer, they call it fire retardant.
I like that.
Yeah. So what puts fires out are people on the ground. Aerial resources are very important to us in large fires because they can mitigate some of the fire behavior such that humans can get in and put a fire line in. But they're not. Unless you're in cheatgrass on the east side of the gorge, and maybe people will see that, where a retardant plane or a seaplane comes and drops on it and it seems to go out. And that is the case with short cheatgrass. That can happen. But in a large timber fire, you know, there was a lot of calls for, why didn't you use the VLAT, which is the very large air tanker 747? Well, a VLAT can't drop very slow, so it has to fly fast and high. And by the time it gets to the ground, it's tiny little droplets that don't mean anything. You might as well throw money. Like wet money on fire.
I just want to show you guys. I thought this was interesting that the fire camp, you could see how close the fire was. I like that. This is, you guys, tonight, I'll tell you, I can just tell these three people, we're just getting the tiniest little nibble of them. So I know this is hard because I could sit and talk to you for quite some time. But I would love to hear from you two things. One is, what lesson did you learn? And if you could go back and do it again differently, what would you do?
Aha. That is a tough one because I think we learn from every fire. Like, I tell people that you are going to learn your whole career, and if you're not, then it's time to get out of fire. We call ourselves students of fire, and so one thing that I learned.
I also had in here that I would give you the power of waving a magical fire axe, and so if money wasn't a thing, or politics, or any of that.
More firefighters.
Okay. Did you get that, Tucker? So I know you guys have some programs that do that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and we're actually hiring. We weren't successful. No, I'm serious.
That's good. I like that. No, we talked about it in the green room.
Yeah. So they open tomorrow, and the job does.
Yeah.
The application period opens tomorrow. If you know some young, fit people, or you yourself are a young, fit person, and the starting salary is $24.36 per hour up in Trout Lake. If you want to come see me after, I'll take down your information.
You get to learn your whole career.
Yeah.
And
it's great, I tell you.
that's what I was going to say. You got shoved into being a hotshot inadvertently, but here you are. How many years later?
I started in '89.
Okay. And you still like it?
I still like it.
Okay. Scott, it makes it so hard for me to stop asking you questions, but I know we have to. But I would like to thank you for what you did those couple of days for all of us. Thank you. All right. I'll let you take your seat. Okay, Brian, get your act together. Okay? While you get your act together, so Brian Harvey, he asked me to be sure I call him Dr. Brian Harvey. So annoying. All these just huge egos in fire, God. Brian Harvey is the principal investigator at the Harvey Lab at the University of Washington. He has been a joy to talk to every single time I've talked to him. I think it's amazing. He said the only reason they hired him there, though, was because of the similarity in names. So that's really amazing. Brian was the one who, when I said, okay, I need someone who can tell me what's gone on. Eagle Creek, we're 5 years out. What have we learned? Have we learned anything? And his name was the name that came up, and which makes sense if you look at the research that him and many people are doing, as you will see. He's learned some cool stuff, some things we're going to be surprised by tonight. He's also a professor in the forest sciences at University of Washington, and I don't want to keep people out too far past your bedtime, so here's your mic, and take it away.
Careful with the booming voice, too. Whoa, this thing's moving. All right. Hello. It is nice to see everyone. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. This is an honor to be here. It was a nice short drive down from Seattle. Amazingly traffic-free, I think, for the only time I've ever done that drive. So let's hope the way back is just as smooth. But since we have been on mostly Zoom meetings for the last few years, I'm riffing on that theme, and I'm going to be zooming in, zooming out, and zooming forward in some of the insights that we're learning about the Eagle Creek fire. And so I am a forest fire ecologist. I am in awe of people like Jessica and Loretta who are on the front lines and in the real time when these fires are going on, having to make all of those decisions. I have the privilege and flexibility to have a lot longer time scale in a lot of the work that I do and the research that we're doing. And so time scale is going to be an important thing when we're looking through some of the insights that we're seeing here. I'm going to also riff on Sarah's, and I'm going to thank my sponsors before we get going here. I want to give credit where credit is due, because the research that I'm presenting is part of a very large and collaborative project, and series of projects actually, and it's supported by many different folks and involves lots of different collaborators, graduate students, and field technicians in our lab group and beyond. And I will especially want to thank the PhD students in my lab group who are leading several of the components of pieces of this research. And Michelle Bonaducci, Madison Laughlin, Liliana Rangel-Parra, and Jenna Morris are 4 graduate students in my lab who are working specifically on fires in Western Cascadia, or the west side of the Cascades in northern Oregon and Washington. So I'm going to start with a question for you all, which is, if you look at these 3 images of forests, we've got one on the left, one in the middle, one on the right, take 10 seconds and think about what you would call each of these forests. What's the first descriptive term that comes into your mind, or maybe even emotional reaction when you see these 3 images of forests here? And we'll pause for an awkward 8 more seconds here. Give you some time. All right, let's hear it. One on the left. Okay. One in the middle. Okay. One on the right. All right. Amazing. All right. I heard lots of different terms here, and I think at least one of each of these came up with old growth forest on the left, very old forest, younger forest, with some smaller trees in the middle, and then I heard burned sort of unanimously almost for the right side one. And I will say, so I'm a forest fire ecologist. I also think back to when I was 8 years old, because I have an almost 8-year-old kid right now, and I was 8 years old when the 1988 Yellowstone fires happened. And it was one of the most profound memories I have as a kid of absolute horror of watching a forest burn and seeing the news coverage of it when that was going on. We were joking backstage whether that makes me a millennial or not based on my birthday. I'm not sure, because that target is always moving around. But I do have a very vivid memory of the 1988 Yellowstone fires. I was lucky enough in graduate school and beyond to be able to study in Yellowstone and learn a lot of lessons from those fires. And it really has changed the way that I think about the role that fire plays in forest ecosystems, building a little bit on what Jessica talked to us about. And one of the ways I think about that is these are actually all post-fire forests. In fact, that forest on the left burned about 500 years ago in a severe fire, not unlike the one that we're seeing on the right-hand side 2 years ago. And the one in the middle burned about 130 years ago, also in a high severity fire. So especially on the west side of the Cascades and in places like Yellowstone, high severity fires are part of the equation of how these forests work. And that came as a big shock to me when I started learning about this on my journey, and now have spent most of my professional career so far as a forest fire ecologist. Let's zoom out from the Eagle Creek fire for a second and think about it in a broader context of what fire means in the Northwest. It means a lot of different things, as we heard from Jessica. One big key distinction in the Northwest is the difference in the way that fire plays a role in these ecosystems and has for a long time at many different scales. At the broadest scale, we can think about that between the west side and the east side of the Cascades. If we were to go over to the east side of the Cascades, this photograph is near Leavenworth or Ellensburg in Washington, not unlike a lot of the east side of the Cascades in Oregon. Typical ecosystems on the east side are frequent fire, warm, dry, plenty of ignitions have always been there. Fires would have come through really relatively frequently and removed a lot of fuel. And these we often talk about as fuel-limited forests, where the primary adaptation for something like a ponderosa pine is to survive those frequent but low-intensity fires, right? They're often low-severity fires, or at least they were throughout much of the evolutionary history of a species like ponderosa pine. On the west side, a little bit of a different ballgame here, where we have cooler, wetter conditions in general on the west side. Abundant ignitions are still there, but those ignitions rarely align with those hot, dry conditions, much like the ones that Loretta was talking about when the Eagle Creek fire was just getting going. Typically, toward the end of the summer, right around Labor Day, we had the 2020 Labor Day fires. Guess what? Eagle Creek was right around Labor Day. Guess what? The Yakult burn in 1902, same exact week as the 2020 fires. It is a very common alignment of those things at that time of year, but it doesn't happen every year. And so when those ingredients do align of a warm, dry summer, an ignition on the landscape, and those east winds kick up, we've had some very big fires on the west side of the Cascades, not just recently, but also historically. And so because those fires are relatively infrequent, fuel is usually not the limiting factor in fire activity on the west side. It's usually the alignment of those weather conditions, particularly those east winds. So high severity fire is something that these forests have seen before, though when we stand in the middle of a high severity patch, it is a visually jarring feeling. And I will admit, still as a fire ecologist now, having a different lens than I did as an 8-year-old kid, this is something that is alarming when you first see it and start to ask yourself, is the forest ecosystem gonna be okay? Is it gonna come back from something like this? So this is the 2020 Riverside fire, which is one of the fires that we're currently studying. It was substantially bigger than the Eagle Creek fire. Let's zoom it a little bit further back in now to the Eagle Creek fire and think about where it fits into the context here. So we'll get to this map on the left-hand side in a little bit more detail in a second, but just to show you kind of relative to other recent west side fires, there's been about 30 to 35, depending on where you draw the line, that have happened from about where the Beachy Creek, Riverside, Lions Head fires happened and north during the satellite record. So there's nothing magical about these 35 fires other than that in 1984, the Landsat satellite went up, and that's what we use to track and measure a lot of these fires. So kind of a magical start date from a scientific point of view, but a little bit arbitrary. But it gives us a little bit of a window into, if we were to look at a map of fire activity since 1984 in other parts of the West, you'd be hard pressed to find areas that haven't burned. Whereas on the west side of the Cascades, fire is still relatively infrequent and more rare than in other areas. But when it does happen, it happens in a particularly interesting way. Here's a graph. So hopefully Sarah is not going to be offended by this, but I promise you there's some important information we've got to see here on this graph. One way to think about a fire regime is how big and how severe fires are. This is all of those fires on the west side since 1984 with a couple big whoppers from the historical record added in there, I'll get to in a second. And basically the x-axis on the bottom here is size of the fire in hectares. Sorry, I'm a scientist. If you use acres in land management, do the math in your head. I'm sorry, I can't do it. I'll try to do my best, but size on the X and the percentage of those fires burned at high severity on the Y-axis. What's really interesting is small fires are all over the map. But once you get to those big fires, particularly those that are driven by those east wind events, they really settle in at about 50 to 60% of the fire burning at high severity. So it's not hard to imagine that when you think about the conditions that Loretta mentioned with those winds kicking up in the Eagle Creek fire, and certainly what we saw in 2020 with even more profound east wind events. And so Eagle Creek, believe it or not, kind of sits in the middle and actually to the lower end of some of the big fires that we've seen on the west side of the Cascades. It is no small fire by many measures, but when we think about the Tillamook fire in 1933 or the Yakult fire, these are a little bit bigger with a question mark on them because we've got some good ballpark ideas of how big those fires were and how severe they were. But obviously we didn't have satellites up in the sky back then, so they didn't make that 1984 birth date cutoff. But Eagle Creek still is a little bit smaller in comparison to some of the 2020 fires that we saw. Now, if we look at the burn severity map, basically what we do is we take satellite images prior to the fire, satellite images after the fire, and look at the change in those two satellite images, and that gives us a good idea of how much of that fire burned at high severity. As Jessica mentioned, one of the measures that we can use is how many trees were killed or what percentage of the trees were killed. That's basically what we're looking at here is a map of tree death or tree mortality in that fire. Some pretty big patches. That is important for a lot of our tree species in this region because most of our dominant tree species need to reproduce by seed, and therefore if you've got a big patch of high severity fire like that, they've got to send seeds in all the way in there to be able to regenerate or reproduce the forest. So Eagle Creek was 55% high severity or stand replacing. If you look at an image like this, all of that yellow area kind of stands out and you think, how is this thing going to come back? But when you start to actually play out the mechanism of seeds being able to disperse, and a lot of our big conifer trees like Douglas fir, western hemlock, silver fir, they can disperse seeds easily 100 meters or more, and make a map now of the distance to the nearest seed source on that burned landscape. And actually you see a very different picture start to emerge where most of the area, 75% of the burned area is within 120 meters of a surviving forest. And that is about the regular dispersal kernel of a lot of these trees in terms of how they're able to send seeds out. 90% of the burned area is actually 350 meters, and only 10% of the burned area is really far away from surviving forest. So we start to get a little bit of a different picture of how severe this fire might have been from affecting the forest ecosystem at least. So what does this look like on the ground? Well, this is where our work starts to look a little bit different from the top-down view from the satellites, but let's zoom in. And part of the work that we're doing in our research group and with our collaborators is installing a network of plots across currently 8 different fires that have burned up and down western Cascadia. You can see Eagle Creek there in the yellow. And I'll save you the gory details of all of the things that we measure in these plots, and that image, little box right there that kind of looks like the master plans to the Death Star in Star Wars. That's just a plot diagram. Just highlighting the fact that we measure a lot of different things over a hectare size. So that's an easy one. 2.5 acres is the size of our plot, and we measure the heck out of a bunch of stuff in there. We'll leave it at that for now. What's a day in the life of a forest fire ecology field crew look like? Well, we've got our home base for the summer. It looks kind of like the tent village that the firefighters are using, though again in a little bit less stressful of an environment than when the fire is burning. We get up in the morning, we plan things out for where we're gonna go. We gotta drive out to these sites, which if any of you have toured around in the Eagle Creek fire since it's burned, you know that that in its own is a little bit of an adventure, and you gotta be very careful. These aren't exactly the safest places to be driving. Get the gear out, and then you start walking to the plot. So these are also very long days. Sometimes we're walking on trails, sometimes we're bushwhacking, and you gotta be careful you're not losing your neighbor in front of you because the vegetation is coming back so densely in some areas. Then we get there, we start to set out this 1 hectare or 2.5 acre plot, and it gets really dense really fast in some areas. Sometimes you need to have multiple people lined up and shouting to make sure that you're actually keeping a straight line with setting up all these measurements. And then we get down on our hands and knees and start measuring things. And this is really hard work. It's really detailed work. It's kind of sad. Everything I'm going to show you is one day. And in this one day, that's about the time that it takes for us to measure one plot. Sometimes not even a full plot, because we're measuring lots of different things in them. So sometimes measuring stuff is a little bit easy, like you see on the right hand here. Sometimes you really got to get down there with a hand lens and look at the different venation patterns on the leaves to be able to tell one species from another, because a lot of species look different from one another. And in these plots, we're measuring every single plant species that is there that's recorded, and how many of them are there, and in what abundance that are there, so we can look at how the vegetation forest community is coming back. Sometimes you got to look it up in the guide to figure out what species is there, because we're always coming across new things that we haven't seen before and building our toolkit. Sometimes you got to take some home, like Liliana is here, and back at camp at the end of the day, be identifying those species and basically coming up with a catalog of everything we've measured in the plot. At the end of that day, we probably look more like coal miners than we do forest fire ecologists at this point, because you're covered in soot, we've got everything we need, and we come back. And if we're lucky, we've measured one plot in a day. And like I said, we've been putting out 160 of these, so it's been a lot of hard work to gather some of the information. And I'm just going to end today on some of the highlights of what it looks like these forests are headed towards, zooming forward now. So kind of riffing on that zoom once again here. So what does it look like on the ground, right? We looked at this high severity burn map. 55% of the Eagle Creek fire, more or less, burned at high severity. What if we went into those high severity areas right now and said, okay, let's look at one of the areas that's close to a seed source. Standard placing fire killed 100% of the trees that were live prior to the fire, but a seed source nearby. You might see something like this if you walk into it. I'm sure many of you have probably seen this from the road, from the trail, walked through scenes like this a lot. And I will say, whether I was my 8-year-old self or the first time I started measuring things as a fire ecologist, from that point in time, or between those 2 points in time, every time I went through a scene like this, my initial reaction was, this forest has been destroyed. When is the forest going to be coming back? Look at what has been lost, going to what Jessica was talking about. And my eyes were drawn to that. I love trees. My 8-year-old kid says I have a tree job. He thinks he equates me with trees at this point. So my eyes are drawn to everything that was lost here. But one of the things that really blows me away is when we start measuring things, we are really starting to put together the pieces of this puzzle that you can't see from afar. And if you get down on your hands and knees and start quantifying things, we found that in many of these areas, the post-fire tree population, it's little tiny seedlings, little tiny trees, often exceeds the pre-fire tree population. Many of these species are actually ready to rock and roll and send seeds in as soon as that fire happens from nearby seed sources, or sometimes even hanging on. They might die, but just long enough to be able to put out one more crop of seeds. And in fact, in the Eagle Creek fire, over 2/3 of our plots that are within that buffer of a seed source are already above minimum stocking densities for ODF, Washington DNR, or Forest Service. But when you go out into the middle of those patches, you might imagine the seedling density really starts to drop off, and you might wonder, what's going on? Is it a black hole when the forest isn't coming back in the middle of these forests, in the middle of these fires? And so what about way out there in these burn patches? What if I took you into the middle of the big burn patch here, which is kind of right in the middle of the Eagle, like kind of in the geographic center of the Eagle Creek fire? This is really far from surviving tree seeds and seed sources. This is in the middle of a whopper patch. This plot that we're going to look at here is about 1,000, no, actually is over 1,000 meters or 1 kilometer from the nearest unburned edge. So it is way out there. And this is where you might think, when the heck is the forest going to be coming back here? And in fact, if you were to get on your hands and knees here, you would find very few conifer tree seedlings, Douglas fir, western hemlock, silver fir, things that are coming back in those areas where there are seed sources nearby. And you might think, that's that's not good if that's what you're looking for. But there's also lots of other things that are coming back here that are actually not that common in those areas that are dominated by the conifer trees. And in fact, one of the species here is red stem ceanothus. This species is a seed banking species. It has seeds that lay dormant between fires and are ready to sprout when a fire happens. As soon as that happens, it also pairs with bacteria that it houses in its root nodules so that it can fix nitrogen and bring nitrogen back into the system. We call it a nitrogen fixing species. This is a critical species for forest ecosystem recovery. And look at how rigorous it is, or vigorous it is growing. I bet some of you didn't even see in that past picture there was a helmet in there. I've zoomed in on Christian, one of our field techs, and that's his helmet right there. And Jenna Morris, one of our PhD students, is a little bit more vertically challenged than Christian is, and you can't even see Jenna in here because she's entirely covered up by the red stem ceanothus. So this species was just waiting for a fire to happen. Guess what? It is, because it's fixing nitrogen, it's also really nutritious. It is preferred browse for ungulate species like elk. This is some of the best elk forage that's out there in recently burned forests. You've got avalanche lily coming back, all sorts of herbs and shrubs that are not as common in unburned forests as they are in burned forests, particularly things like lupin, beargrass, resprouting species like bigleaf maple. That's got another trick up its branch, not sleeve. And if you think about a forest that is dominated by conifer trees, which has needle leaves, evergreen leaves, those things are really tough and not tasty to a lot of animals. But after a fire, you have a whole suite of species that's coming in, very high diversity. We've been finding about, on average, 40 or so species of herbs and shrubs, not counting the grasses, in these post-fire plots. There's about 40 or so species in old growth forests, but it's a totally different 40 species that shows up in these recently burned forests. And they're species that have really tasty and fast-growing and easily decomposable leaves that are very good food that sets up an entire food web that is now much more complex than even in an old growth forest in some dimensions. So some closing thoughts on the 2017 Eagle Creek fire and some of those images that I just showed and insights that I just showed. When you see a scene like this, you very well might have the same reaction that I had from about age 8 in 2nd grade all the way through when I started becoming a forest fire ecologist and thinking, man, so much has been lost. What is, like, this looks like a horribly tragic kind of slug in the gut scene. And I totally get that, and that is part of what's going on here because some has been lost from the fire. But at the same time, there's a lot that is there that was not there prior to the fire. And it's a different ecosystem. But guess what? That's what old growth forests that we know and love today looked like after the last high severity fire. So with any luck, some of these recently burned forests are on their way to becoming an old growth forest. These recent fires on the west side are actually doing something that is very interesting in this region too. Talked a little bit about the timber wars, and I know you all heard about that last year. Old growth forests are in very short supply regionally compared to the historical levels of old growth forest. The most rare condition in forests on the west side of the Cascades is not old growth forest. It's actually the early seral complex habitat that occurs after a fire or after a natural disturbance. And that is really important for a lot of different biodiversity that is not present in old growth forests. So these are both important pieces of the puzzle. And then there's a huge abundance of younger or middle-aged forests on the west side. And when fire happens, it's going to burn some of those and turn them into early seral, and some of them it's not going to burn, and they may become old growth forests with given enough time. Another takeaway, another insight here is I often say after a fire, I used to look at an image on the left and it felt like a slug in the gut. Now I say fasten your seatbelt, because forests are very long-lived ecosystems and often slowly changing, but always changing. But they do not change as fast at any other point in a forest's cycle as they do right after a fire. And the turnover from year 1 to year 3 to year 5 is absolutely mind-blowing if you're measuring and tracking what's going on there. In fact, we're seeing species that have already come and gone in some of these areas, that they've had their time and now they're waiting for the next fire. So with all of that, the other thing to remember, going back to the timescale piece, is there's more to come. We are only on the very first few steps of the first leg of the relay race for these forests. If we think about something like a 700-year-old old-growth forest that was born of a high-severity fire 700 years ago, everything I just showed you from Eagle Creek, and you all know living in and around Eagle Creek, it's been on display. It's just the first 5 years of this play that is going to continue over decades, centuries, perhaps close to a millennia in some locations. So more to come. We're going to keep studying this stuff. And with that, I'll say thanks. And I'm happy, as Loretta said, happy to have folks, if you want to reach out, contact me there, and happy to share more about our work. Thank you.
If you guys don't mind coming up here, and we're limited on mics. Sorry, Loretta, you got to get back in the limelight. So I'm hoping you guys can kind of pull off Loretta's lav and use that as your mic to answer. And then, Joe, if you'll raise the house lights. Usually I ask the first question, but I want to get to you guys because I have a feeling that we have some questions in here. So let's do it. Jurgen.
Thank you. I'm Jurgen Hess. Jerry Franklin and I reviewed Chad Hansen's book called Smokescreen. Are you familiar with that book? He's a professor in the Sierras, and he feels that, one, we shouldn't do any prescribed fire. Two, we shouldn't even fight fires. And, well, I won't tell you Jerry Franklin in my opinion, but I'd like to get your thoughts on those things.
Anyone who feels like you've got something.
I think you have to have a surrogate to fire if we're going to keep putting fires out. And thinning and prescribed burning is a really good surrogate to fire. We still have to protect communities. How we do that could change a little bit, but it's a personal opinion that's shared by many. I think thinning and prescribed burning is the way to go. And it's not in every ecosystem. I mean, obviously in wilderness, we want fire to play as natural a role as it could, but we do have human values, and we do have, I live in Parkdale, and there's fuel all around my house, and, I like thinning and prescribed burning.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add to that, I think there are lots of different pieces to the puzzle of how we need to interact with these forests and with fire, and that the answers to what might be appropriate are really going to differ from place to place. But these have been cultural landscapes with people interacting with forests and with fire for a very long time, and I think we need to appreciate that and apply the appropriate tools in the appropriate place. Because as Laura was talking about, fire is not going away in these ecosystems. And so there are lots of things that we can do, and then there are limits to those things that we can do.
Okay. Who's got a question? Otherwise, I get to start us. Oh, hello. Hold on. No, let me get the mic.
Oh, I have a pretty loud voice. I've been wanting to ask this question for over 20, 30 years. I know, because we hear so much about the human toll and the biological, the tree toll and everything, but I keep on wondering when I have these huge forest fires, what's happening to the pileatids and the bats and the owls and the voles and are they all just dying?
Well,
I know that may not be any of your expertise, but
it's not my expertise, but I have seen lots of animals fly away from fire and run away from fire. And after a fire, it seems like mouse populations explode, and I'm sure vole populations. I don't know about tree voles, but not all the trees burn, so I would think that some of them would survive and then perpetuate. But yeah, let's have the fire ecologists sort of.
Those that can move often fare better than those that can't. However, even those that can't have amazing adaptive capacity to do things like burrow and, outstand a fire depending on the intensity. So I would just go back to, habitat loss for one species is habitat gained for another, and a lot of species move around or have adaptive capacity. Now, if you want to ask about a specific species, we could see if we know, but yeah, it's kind of cool, You do still see animals even right after, during mop-up and stuff after it's burned. You're like, where were you when the fire came through? And so we don't have all the answers either. We wonder, that kind of stuff. Are there caves? There's all kinds of ways different wildlife can adapt.
All right. So I saw someone over here have. Do you want me to use my deep voice for you?
Thank you. Okay, so this goes back 50 or 60 years. When I first came out to this county, my ex-father-in-law told me that there weren't forest fires so much back when, because the natives in this area used to come through in the fall and torch the undergrowth and the dried leaves and all the stuff that now builds up to be, the fuel for these big fires. So is there any truth to that?
Yes and no. They didn't just willy-nilly go out and clean up the forest with rakes and drip torches or, matches, if you will. There was always a reason behind it. So whether they were flushing animals for hunting or whether they were promoting cultural species of importance like huckleberries and beargrass and those sorts of things, they certainly used fire, and that affected the fire regime. Again, the way fire naturally wants to burn on a landscape. But, that's in areas where their species of interest occur. They're not, like I said, they're not just going around and maintaining forest, away from these species by dragging matches with them just to keep fire from burning. So it's going to vary, in some habitats more than others. But anybody want to add?
Sure, yeah, and I'll just, the point that I was making earlier about these being cultural landscapes, they have been cultural landscapes for at least 10,000 years or so when people have been on them. And so fire has been used as a management tool in this part of North America, even on the west side of the Cascades, and continues to be today, right? So we are a big part of that equation, and thinking that we're not can be challenging and lead to bigger challenges. But that doesn't mean that big wildfires also didn't happen, right? I think there's evidence historically that fire use at a lot of different scales was part of these landscapes, as well as lots of paleoecological evidence that large fires came through periodically. And so these, even on the west side, these would have been mosaic-y landscapes of small and large fires, but just different than a lot of other ecosystems where large fires weren't part of the equation. And on the west side of the Cascade, there's historical evidence that large fires, particularly these east wind-driven fires, are part of the equation and have been for a while.
That reminds me, though, that at some point in the future, I don't know when, I want to look at a potential for a lecture on traditional ecological knowledge from within the tribes. So it's there. It's in my head. Okay? Yes, sir.
I'm Darrell Ward, retired Forest Service fire researcher. I know that there's concern being voiced over fires reburning. What do you think the probability is that the Eagle Creek fire is going to reburn? And what period of time might that occur?
So with climate change, we don't exactly know the answer, but from my experience, I started the bulk of my career in North Cascades up on Lake Chelan, and we had some fires that burned there, and we thought, okay, we're good. we're good for like 15 years. Well, the same area burned again 10 years later. And then we thought, okay, well, maybe we're good for 10 years. And then it was 2015, and it burned in a very spectacular way through the same burn area, and that was only 5 years. Maybe it was 6, but it was 6 years after the Domkey Lake fire had burned. And so, yeah, it's changing, and we don't really know the answer. Brian and I talked about it a little bit. You know, we had the big Hollow Fire in 2020, and then we just had the Suisun fire that burned, and it did actually burn pieces here and there, and that's only 2 years. So, yeah, it's hard to, it didn't like burn through it. It just like picked spots, and it spotted through it, but it still burned a little bit. I wouldn't say it burned through, but yeah, we're talking 6 years right now. If our historic events are reaching new historic events like all the time, every year I say, wow, I've never seen that before. And I've been saying that every year now for quite a while.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the 2022 reburn of the 2020 fire. And there's also, we were talking earlier about the historical fires like the Yakult burn. Prior to the recent years of 2017 and 2020, in Western Washington at least, the majority of fire activity since the Yakult burn in that region was within the Yakult burn footprint, and lots and lots and lots of reburns. And so that is something that has historically happened again. You know, it's part of what seems to characterize these ecosystems and the fire ecology of these ecosystems, but it could be changing going forward. And it's one of the things we're actually, the slide that had the Death Star plans of our plot layout, one of the things we're measuring in there is the fuel profiles, and then working with some of our management partners to see what the options are if you were to look at the post-fire reburn risk, and then thinking about different options of fuel reduction or, you know, managing the fire risks following one fire in those areas. So it's ongoing research right now, and I know there's several other projects regionally looking at that. So I think that is going to be a big concern, because it could be one of the things that we start to see emerge more often as at least the climate part of the equation, the weather part of the equation kind of keeps getting kicked into higher gear.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more, so if you have it, don't hold back now.
Quick question, kind of a two-part question. I'm curious, just what effect does clear cutting, or what effect does clear cutting have, I guess, on wildfires? Like, do you think it exacerbates it? Do you think they, just in general, what the effect is, and maybe that's like after a clear cut, and then how do clear cuts, when they've regrown, burn in comparison to regular forests?
Well, first I want to say the Forest Service no longer clear cuts. I do want to point out, though, that a clear cut is actually mimicking a natural disturbance regime. And so I think we, as an agency, we're irresponsible in using the clear cut, particularly in the 80s. But yeah, it's a different kind of fire regime when you have a clear cut. And I'm going to let fire ecologists speak to this question, because
I'll say that forests that are typically clear cut aren't starting off in a natural condition. So whether they burn the same as a natural forest or not is an easy answer. No, because they're a homogeneous plantation of the same size trees, of the same species of trees, the same age of trees. So that's going to be different. Now, if you're talking about once the trees are removed, it really depends on your slash disposal method, how that's going to burn. If you go through and you do a prescribed burn afterwards or a broadcast burn to remove the slash, as often timber management corporations will do as part of site prep for the next round of trees to be planted, then you probably don't have a lot of slash left behind that is fodder for the next fire, if you will. But there's all kinds of different ways to do it. So I think, we do this a lot where we compare a managed landscape to an unmanaged landscape. And there's just so many variables that go into how you're managing and for what purposes, that it's not a straight, apples to oranges comparison. And so, it's what did you leave on the ground after you did it? And was it done to prevent fire from burning? And if it was as part of a fuels reduction project, then you probably don't have a lot of fuels left and you have really affected that. But if you're just getting the trees out and leaving, all of the things that fell out of the canopy on the ground, if you will, in the process of removing those trees, then you've definitely changed your fuel profile and potentially exacerbated future fire behavior.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
I thought so, yeah.
Okay. All right, any final questions? I know there's a lot, but we'll just... Way in back? Oh, goodness. Okay, you guys, teamwork. Here we go. Oh, but then I can't get it recorded for the live stream, so we're just thinking of the people at home. Thank you.
I'm going to put you on the spot in an area maybe not exactly in your expertise, but the gorge is such a special place, and most of the trails that were destroyed by the fire remain closed. Presumably they're still just destroyed, except for Eagle Creek and a few others. Do you have any thoughts on how the Forest Service generally reacts to letting the public back in? And like within our lifetime, maybe? Or no, just impossible?
I think there are people in the audience that could answer this question.
Raise your hand if you have the answer.
Yeah, Christy? Lynn? It's mostly open.
So my name is Lynn Burdett. I was the area manager at the time of the Eagle Creek fire and addressed things afterwards. We have several folks here who helped with that. Gary Burkle helped organize. The approach that was used was to identify the high-intensity areas, the most dangerous places, those kinds of things. We initially closed off the entire area while we tried to determine that, and then went through a risk assessment process, and then started the way of working our way in with trails. It would surprise me that most of the trails remain closed. I don't think that's an accurate statement right now. There are a few that are closed still, but I believe that the majority of trails are now open to the public. Initially, the approach we had taken, and I've retired, so I don't know if they're still continuing this, but initially the approach was to have the area closed, and then as we open trails, to only open like 25 feet or so on either side. And I know that was frustrating to a lot of people, especially folks who like some of the trails that were not official trails. The reason for that, though, was to keep people on the trail tread itself, as opposed to climbing through the areas where the researchers, you saw some of the pictures. And our concern was, as people got off of the trails, they could get lost, but they also were going to cause damage and create situations where you'd have rocks rolling down and that kind of thing. So I believe the majority of trails are now open. The Oneonta Gorge remains closed, while a determination is being made on both how that's recovering as a result of not having large crowds of people in there, but also how could it safely be accessed again. So that's probably a quick answer to that. There is a website for the Forest Service, and you can go to it, and they have, actually, you can click on each trail and see what the status of it is and where the closure orders are. So, thank you, Lynn. Thank you very much. You're welcome.
that makes me think that there was one thing that I wanted to make sure we do before we left tonight. Joe, if you don't mind bringing, if there's any more lights out there, but otherwise, no. I know there are a lot of people in this audience who are in one way or another are involved with wildfire, wildland, firefighting, management of it, being on the ground of it. And I would love for you to please stand up at this point. If you are someone who at some point in your career has worked with wildfire, wildland, you guys know what I'm trying to say. And I know who a lot of you are, so if I don't see you stand up, I'm going to start calling you out. So I know you're there. Kat Arndt, I know you're there. Loretta, I need you to just...
Yeah, I'm going to start calling out people. Eric Castaneda, I see you up there.
Stand up, Eric. There we go. There's some more.
Aaron.
Thank you, Kat.
Yeah, Christy. Yeah.
There's some more over there.
Yeah. So this is another one of those, we need to thank our sponsors. You know, these are the people on the ground doing the hard work out there, and they have my utmost respect, and I think everybody else's too. So
thank you, guys.
Thank you for what you do.
Thank you. With that, I'm going to ask you guys one last question, which is think what's the little elevator thing you want people to leave with so they can tell your gospel to the world when they walk out of here based on your knowledge. And while they think of that, I want to thank Joe Garoot and Big Britches Productions. They do all the live streams. So for all the people that aren't here tonight, there's a lot. They're able to watch it, and then that means that this will go into our archive. So the Sense of Place archive will have this entire video available for free online into infinity. So thank you, Joe. Thank you, John. Kyle Ramey, hi. What should I do this time? Like that? Okay. Kyle's our photo ninja. Etta Sauser, who you guys met when you came in, is my partner in so many things, and she does all the pieces that I'm not very good at. Columbia Center for the Arts. It's so nice to be here. And how about Wacoma Books now in the gallery for a little bit? And Mount Adams Institute, obviously. I also have the rare chance tonight to thank the people that are responsible for me, which is my parents. And I want to tell you I love you, and thank you for encouraging me to talk to different people when I was a kid, because I still want to do it now. We thank the wildfire people. The one thing that Jessica and I went on the radio, and someone heard us and said, hey, guess what? We're doing some really awesome stuff your audience might be interested about. OSU Extension got a huge grant to, in Hood River and Wasco counties, put in air quality monitors. And I don't know a lot about it, but there's information out there, and I think that you should all check it out because, as we all know, having lived through Eagle Creek, that's a reality. So look for this. You can find information on those monitors, where they're located, what they're finding out. And then they also have an upcoming session where they want public input on the community response to smoke. I'm murdering this. I'm not doing as nearly as well as I should. The Gorge Smoke Sensor Project, and also just what the community wants out of how we monitor and manage smoke in the air, which is going to be happening. So I think those are all the pieces. Oh, no, it's not. Next month, living snow. Do you know when you were a little kid and you'd be at a glacier and it'd be pink and you would want to eat it because it looked like the snow cone that you had at the fair, and your parents would tell you not to eat it because it would kill you? Well, maybe that was just me. So that pink snow is alive, and it's telling us things. And there's a woman next month, Robin Codner, who is coming here. She is an incredible alchemist who goes to these high areas with her researchers to seek out that pink snow, find out what's alive in it, and figure out what that tells us, not only about the current snow and glacial ecosystems, but what that's going to tell us about what's coming. So come meet Robin next month. She's amazing. Okay. What do you want to leave us with?
Think about what you value. It's your public lands. You get a choice in how they're managed.
Do your part. If you have a house in the woods, you should do your fuel reduction. There are programs out there with the Oregon Department of Forestry and the Washington Department of Natural Resources for cost share if you need help with that. It helps all firefighters.
Fire is a complex issue. and there are simple questions and really complex answers to them, and that's one of the things that makes it a really fascinating and important topic for us to continue to all be thinking about and working on. So thanks for listening tonight.
Thank you all. Thank you guys. It's a sense of place. I'm Sarah Fox. Thank you guys very much. Have a good night. What?
Do you know how long it?
Well, it's so funny. I have a clock up there that I always have facing out so I can watch time, but someone's sitting in front of it this time, so I have no.